into the second quarter of the 21st century, innovation is in the driver's seat as computers, internet communications, and artificial intelligence becomes the rule and not the exception in terms of how things get done. One of those innovations is self-driving cars, and more specifically, autonomous trucks. Though the technology isn't quite ready for full driverless trucks on all open roadways, the debate over the implications and effects of that deployment is far from silent. Some say they look forward to it, others are not so positive. Nevertheless, the time of the autonomous truck is coming soon. How will it be regulated? What laws will it test? How will it affect recruitment and retention of drivers? All these questions and more we'll address next on FreightWaves Presents Autonomous Trucks. And welcome to FreightWaves Presents. I'm Bill Priestley. For decades, Western society has had its fill of science fiction, from floating sillies to hyperdrive to robots and artificial intelligence. We've been inundated with what the future can look like. Now in 2023, we can start to see what some of that future can look like with driverless vehicles. Once seen as a far-fetched dream, autonomy is on the brink of reality. So how did we get here? Let's set the stage. Hard to believe it, but the history of autonomous vehicles goes back as far as 1926, when a man named Francis P. Houdina hooked up a remote control system to a 1926 Chandler and drove it up and down Broadway and Fifth Avenue in New York City. It was dubbed the American Wonder. Fast forward through the middle of the century, and competition started to come from Japan and Germany. And while lots of claims were being made about the onset of autonomous vehicles, like the car can let the driver sit back and relax, and note that doesn't mean they stop driving, the only development that made it to commercial production was cruise control back in the 1980s. Eventually, the Society of Automotive Engineers came up with 6 levels of automation for vehicles, ranging from no automation to complete automation where the driver is not required. Level 1 was achieved with cruise control, and Level 2 was achieved commercially, where the vehicle can control the steering and acceleration, though the driver can still override the vehicle. Past those levels, automation systems then take over the driving environment, meaning the human is there but not in control and can only override the vehicle. And the golden achievement is Level 5 autonomy, which is that vehicle that can do all of the driving without the presence of a driver. Been an interesting road so far, and again, a lot of those things necessarily haven't been seen to the commercial level yet, but they're certainly under research, and some of them are being put into practice now there as well. Joining us to give us a kind of a full picture of where we are right now is our Midwest Bureau Chief, Alan Adler, who joins us from Michigan. Alan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
This is obviously a very exciting time to be alive when you're looking at the idea of autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucks. And you've been covering this for quite some time. So right now, April 2023, what's the situation look like when it comes to autonomous technology in freight?
Well, I think the technology is largely there to do up to Level 4 autonomy. And it's interesting because Level 5 really is cognitive replacement. That is where the vehicle thinks for itself. It's not going to do that for many, many years. No telling exactly when. Level 4 right now is in operation. It's in operation, but it's being monitored by humans. And that's probably an important distinction, because even though we have a couple of companies that are planning commercial routes next year, end of 2024, it is still a science that needs to be watched. And, you know, the idea of an 80,000-pound vehicle operating without anybody in the cab is a little bit disconcerting to some people.
It's obviously a very expensive business to get in, because obviously you're talking about state-of-the-art technology and everything that goes into it there as well. Obviously, we've had some groups of companies that have come in. A lot of them have taken a really hard shot at this, and some have fallen by the wayside to some degree or so forth. How practical is it, trying to get into this business? Because obviously, there's a long race to get to the finish line, but you got to have a lot of money and a lot of willpower and a lot of belief in your stockholders if you're going public to make it there.
Yeah, I mean, the autonomous space really started in ride hailing and in cars, right? And, along the way, around 2016, 2017, companies began to realize that a much better model for use of autonomous driving was trucks because they don't do as many different things as cars do. And they don't need to know everything about what's on every curb everywhere. Because if you use them for what's called the middle mile from a hub to hub type of operation where the truck comes to a place, it gets loaded, and then it's driven autonomously to another place, and then it's unloaded by a human. You're making the best possible use of autonomy at that point. Training these vehicles, these robots, if you will, to master surface streets and to sit in traffic and things like that, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. The most you're seeing is some of the companies now are getting the trucks off the off-ramp autonomously and back to their depot or their terminal, but they're not really trying to master surface streets. So that's where the cruise automations of the world and some of the other, Waymo and those folks that are working on ride-hailing vehicles, they have to learn everything and they've got to relearn it as things change. There is some level of common practice, light mapping, if you will, that has to be done for trucks.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of work to go, and also some of those developments coming every day. You've been covering this obviously for quite some time. Are you surprised in the way that the autonomous race, if you will, has unfolded the way it is in terms of not only just who's involved, but how much they're involved and how this technology has started to roll itself out over the course of, say, the last 6, 7, 8 years?
Well, you mentioned early on that you alluded to a shakeout that is underway, and this is true for any new technology, whether it be LiDAR or whatever, telephones. I mean, it can be anything, and so you are seeing now a shakeout of companies that are not have enough money to make it at this point. This is a brutal environment to raise money, as we've talked about many times on FreightWaves shows. But for those that do have money, they've got a little longer runway. They can go a little longer and can continue to perfect what they're doing. But this technology bill is one that is quite some time from being an actual profit generator. Even when you're running commercial routes, you're still going to be in the early days. You're not going to be getting the kind of scale or volume that you really need to make money. The promise of autonomous trucking is, in fact, the removal of the driver from the long haul business. And when that happens, you're talking about saving, upwards of 40%, because the driver is your most expensive portion of running a truck. So if you take the driver out of that, not necessarily getting rid of the job, because you may find new jobs for them and, loading the trucks or working in the depots or driving the last mile, which I think is going to continue to be a human activity for a really long time, then you've got jobs that actually are more palatable. And I sound like I'm parroting what the industry says, but it makes a great deal of sense if you think about it. I mean, there isn't that much interest in long haul trucking anyway. There are people who like it, but it's not a business that's easily recruitable. And when you get turnover of 80, 90, 100% a year, that tells you that people are either chasing the bonus that another company might be offering, or they just don't like the work. And as drivers get older, and they are, I mean, I'm not sure the exact age right now, but probably right around 50 years old, it gets a little hard to do this work when you're out on the road for 2 or 3 weeks. An autonomous truck wouldn't care. It'll go 20 hours a day, maybe longer, but 20 hours is a good number simply because you need some time for maintenance and things like that. But they don't get tired, hungry, cranky, distracted. None of that happens through an autonomous truck.
We're going to have a conversation in just a little bit about regulation in terms of what Congress, what the FMCSA may look at that, because obviously that's a major concern there. Let me let you weigh on that as well. When you look at regulation, there's obviously the comment period going on right now.
Right. Well, I think we're going to need some level of federal regulation, but it's just like with California, right now you've got a lot of opposition to autonomous trucking. You cannot use them in the state. You must have a safety driver. And the Teamsters and others are sort of quite noisy about this. You've got the opposition from the industry. Wrote about that last weekend briefly in our Truck Tech newsletter. That there's quite a battle going on there. California is a holdout right now in terms of state regulation for autonomous trucking. You've got about 42 states that allow it, about 8 that don't or are just looking at it. So that is still something that ultimately is going to need some kind of, one size fits all regulation across the country. It's important to be able to note that the beginnings of autonomy are going to be in the Southwest. And the reason for that is because the weather's good, the roads are flat, and you just typically don't run into as many what are called edge cases for autonomy as you would say if you were trying to do it in Minnesota or North Dakota.
Yeah, of course. Also, you've got the weather there as well as a major factor. January is going to happen, whether you like it or not, in that particular area of the country. Of course, then you know that as well, being in Michigan there. Right now, what is perhaps the main concern going forward in terms of is it the technology, just trying to build the technology and make it work? Is it that there is government intervention possibly on the way or an oversight? Also, what about selling it? I mean, is that going to be an issue in terms of, is this going to be something really expensive that carriers are going to have to flip the bill for?
Well, I think what you're looking at, the companies that are somewhat successful, and it's really, I'm not going to rank them for you, but companies like Aurora that have partnerships with truck makers like PACCAR and Volvo, Torque Robotics, which is actually a independent subsidiary of Daimler Truck. These are the guys that, quite honestly, have the inside track because they've got a company that is going to ultimately listen to them and probably build a chassis that has the necessary redundancy. And by that, I mean simply that it's got systems that back up other systems, since there's no driver presumably in the truck to take over if there's a problem. So these redundant chassis are incredibly important, and the companies that have the partnerships are in a much better place. Now, the manufacturers that are doing them are ultimately going to make them available to others for, plug and play type systems. And so there will be a shakeout there too, in terms of, what is the autonomous system that works the best, makes the most sense. I don't think we're really at a discovery stage right now, Bill. I think where we are is in a validation stage. I think companies like Too Simple, which demonstrated in late 2021 that it could go 80 miles autonomously, nobody in the cab, and they did it at night. They did it on I-10 in Arizona, which is going to be their first route at the end of 2024. That's their target. To actually do this, it's something that, it's known. Now it's a question of validating it and learning as much as possible and making it as safe as possible.
Gotcha. We've got about 30 seconds left here, so let me let you put on your crystal ball, if you will. You said 2024. That's a big date for a lot of people. It seems like coming forward. What do you think is the next big advancement we're going to hear about in autonomous space?
I think you may have already heard it. I think it's going to be people that are planning limited route use, commercial runs, and that sort of thing. I think that's the next big thing. All
right. Alan Adler, our Midwest Bureau Chief, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Of course, that brings us to a very interesting conversation, which we got to a little bit with Alan, about regulation in terms of how this new technology is going to be regulated. The FMCSA has a new comment period that has just started recently in terms of getting information on how autonomous vehicles will be regulated. Joining us now from Washington, D.C., Randy Mullet, Senior Advisor at Imaginovate. Randy. Joining us there, and this is an interesting thing. You've got the FMCSA, you've got the DOT, you've got Congress. Let me just open the door there for you there at that particular point. What concerns you the most when it comes to regulating autonomous technology?
So I have two concerns. Number one is that they'll leave this totally up to the states, and we'll get a hodgepodge of regulation that makes it impossible to take advantage of the full efficiencies out of that. And then the second thing is just the opposite, that they overreact and squash the new technology or make it so onerous that it becomes impossible, once again, to take advantage of the full efficiencies or the safety benefits.
Gotcha. Lauren Smith also joining us here, CEO of Skyline Policy Group. Lauren, thanks so much again for joining us. What's your take on how the FMCSA, the DOT, Congress, what are your concerns when it comes to the government interacting with autonomous technology?
Well, Bill, I think that's fundamentally it. I mean, can the technologies that will expand safety and expand economic efficiency, so advancing the goals of the Department of Transportation, are companies going to be able to make use of those technologies, or are we going to see hurdles put up that what is the extent of the safety margin that we need to make sure that we have on the roads, and again, trying to improve the current road safety standards, because we have had record fatalities on the road, and so I think that's what the regulators are trying to balance, to make sure that the economic opportunities, that the safety advances of the technology over the longer term are commensurate with improving near-term safety.
It's interesting that when you look at this situation, a lot of people, and I shouldn't say a lot of people, but there certainly are a group of people that start to look at technology like this and think of, oh gosh, where are we headed now if we can't get in a car and have to let it drive ourselves? This very interesting situation. And so I kind of think that this mimics itself a little bit on the government side in terms of regulation. And so I asked some people what they thought about this particular situation and how government is going to get into it. And I heard one sort of, I won't call it doomsday scenario, but it certainly seemed interesting. In other words, let's say, for instance, somebody makes it to level 5 autonomy and the results are good. It is something that is going to be safe. It is going to work. It has proven itself over time. And there's someone's interesting thought that said, once somebody does that, the federal government may step in and say, okay, they've done it. Now everybody else has to do it the same way. And I kind of think that goes back to Randy's point about overstepping in terms of how that goes. How do you see that? I mean, once somebody gets there, how do you see it playing out from that perspective, from a regulatory standpoint, Randy?
So I don't have as much a concern about that. Usually the first mover theory says that the guy that develops it first definitely controls the ball and the tendency of how it ultimately gets developed. But in the questioning that the FMCSA had in this last go-round, they ask about how should they think about regulating somebody that was operating a vehicle like a drone in a remote location? How should they think about safety inspections, those kinds of things? But once they said, gee, how are we thinking about dealing with people that are operating this vehicle from afar, that's a totally different technology than the vehicle is totally autonomous. And it says to me that they really are trying to stay open to multiple pathways to get this done.
Lauren, what's your take on when somebody finally gets the golden apple, if you will?
Well, I think that it's going to take several years, first of all, for full self-driving or the equivalent of self-driving, what you might call level 5, sort of go anywhere, anytime, to be on the market. I mean, my ballpark would be around 2030 before I'd really expect to see technology of that type. And I think probably it'll be another, maybe 10 years, maybe by 2040 or so, before we really see at large scale trucks operating without any driver at all. I think we're a relatively long ways off there. Just because I think that there's a lot of skepticism that's built up over the past few years. You have safety advocates concerned about sacrificing near-term safety in favor of long-term gains. And I think this is what's, driving a lot of the pressure that self-driving truck companies have been under, is that will they be able to monetize the product, and does the technology actually work? And so I think we're probably going to be in a prove-it era of testing for some time to come on the autonomous technologies. I think in certain controlled environments, when you're talking about yard management, much like we have warehouse operations that are heavily autonomous, I think we may see yard management where it's a sort of a semi-controlled environment. But I think for open road operations, I think we're a relatively longer way off.
Certainly a far cry from Houdina's experiment, which went up Broadway and down Fifth Avenue when he tried it in 1926. Randy, you mentioned states regulating this. There's also an outlier there, and that's California, which has an interesting role to play in this as well. Granted, they're taking the forefront step in terms of emissions, but they're kind of pulling back when it comes to driverless trucks. In terms of regulations, how does the federal government play with California, knowing that obviously there's some power there, and also for the fact that a lot of these autonomous companies are based in California?
Yeah, that proposed law has been really surprised to me, that would require a driver in a vehicle at all times.
Yeah,
that pretty much defeats a lot of the cost benefit of autonomy. And it may ultimately defeat the safety benefit of autonomy if somebody can override the system in ways that aren't as productive as just letting the system do its own thing. What will the feds do? I think it depends on what administration's in power at the time. You know, in the last administration, we had tried to do away with California's emissions waivers. In this administration, we're just going to get out of the way and basically let California control the emissions regulation scheme for the country. So I do think that this is a really, really big deal. I agree with Lauren that, you know, we're still a ways out, but this type of law in that type of state could be a death knell for true autonomous trucks.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting when you have a state as big as California kind of go, quote unquote, counterculture a little bit on you in terms of this, where most of the other states seem to be reasonably supportive of autonomous technology. Lauren, what's your take on how the federal government should or can deal perhaps with California when this issue comes to a head?
Yeah, I think we framed the issue right. We're talking about California and the feds, and I think that the labor union angle here is not to be missed. Which is interesting is that labor unions in California have been in the news quite a bit lately with the West Coast port situation, and I think that safety advocates have also raised concerns about autonomous vehicles. I think the unions certainly have. Back in 2021, when the Teamsters were holding an election to replace Jimmy Hoffa Jr., who the longtime president of the, I think about 25 years president of the Teamsters. The final candidates for the Teamsters presidency were basically arguing, trying to one up each other on how much they opposed the concept of self-driving trucks. And I think that shows a lot of the animus that's out there among a lot of workers towards automation. I think it's still an issue that's animating the West Coast ports. We saw a few months ago with the railroad strike concerns. That I think you have a lot of conflict there as to what extent industries are going to automate versus preserving jobs for workers. And I think that's a huge animating issue. I think that the Department of Transportation, I think the administration is taking those union concerns very much into account in this policy area. And so I think that over the next few years we're going to see probably the California state government as well as the federal regulators working closely together to figure out, what level of automation is appropriate. And I think certainly the union concerns are going to be very high up on the list of considerations.
We've got about a little over a minute left here. Let me jump very quick to my last question, and that's when you look at 2024, obviously big year in autonomy because a lot of announcements will be coming about in that next calendar year. Obviously a big month in political sense because of the election, of course. How much of the regulation and how much of the political attitude towards technology is just simply going to be based on who comes out in office and in power in Congress and in the executive branch? Randy?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with it, and it's basically who favors regulation and who doesn't. Neither extreme is a good thing, but if we're going to move forward, we've got to have ways that allow us to do it in a safe and responsible manner, and one that we can enjoy the efficiencies. Lauren said earlier that it's going to be a few years, and I agree with that, but the technology's ready. It's we who aren't really ready in many instances.
Lauren, your take, but does it matter who's in office?
I think it does. I think the labor consideration, the labor rules are going to matter, not just for restrictions on automation, but also restrictions on certain types of business models. Where we're talking about the AB5 California law, the independent contractor usage by companies, franchising, all those rules, ride sharing, and gig economy work. All of those things will be determined in some way by the policymakers, primarily at the federal level, to some extent at the state level. But I think that certainly does matter. I think Randy, I think we probably disagree a little bit on the immediate usability of automated systems. I'm a little more skeptical that the technology's there. Certainly, a lot of progress has been made, but that might have to be a longer conversation.
And we'll have to be a longer conversation at another time, unfortunately. Randy and Lauren, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So that brings up a very interesting question, of course, is that you've got different types of technology that are going to be used here. Does that mean that carriers will be interested in or could possibly use different rates? Will you be signing up for an autonomous truck, or will you be signing up for a man-made truck? And does that matter in terms of your bottom line? We asked the Freightonomics folks to take a look at that particular problem.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The question I think to ask is, does the market value autonomous truck driving over a human? And I don't know that they will. So in my mind, it's the same service, essentially, that you're getting from an autonomous vehicle. I don't know that they're going to be more reliable, potentially. Autonomous vehicles are going to have to be governed by the same environmental rules. If you think humans are maybe not as efficient, then yes, I think you will get a little bit of a premium for that autonomous service. But I think overall, I don't know that there's going to be a market difference, because the whole idea for autonomous is to drive efficiency operationally. And that's going to actually impact the carrier more in the long run than I think the consumer.
Yeah, I think I agree with that one. I think if you look at freight as a commodity, which we certainly do here at FreightWaves, a freight truck is a freight truck, no matter, who's hauling it or what carrier's name is on it, only if it kind of get into that point of the efficiency standpoint from it. So if the autonomous vehicle can get it from point A to point B faster because it doesn't have to stop for brakes, doesn't have to fuel up, maybe it's also electric as well. So these kind of things also kind of go into factors. So if we can see that, hey, if I go the autonomous route and it's going to get there faster, maybe that will be, a little bit of additive service fee for there and have a premium on it as well.
And to the question about how does that impact OR bottom line, initially, it's going to be an investment. It's going to be an output for the carrier, the operator, or the service provider. And that could negatively impact a near-term margin, just like any investment would. If you front load the investment, it's going to hurt early and then be more profitable in the long run, which of course would be the goal. So I don't know that, anybody's going to be looking to make money on the outset right away, because technology, that's the way I view it, is just like with any technology, you're paying for that R&D. And I don't think the customer, unless they have some sort of efficiency on the service side improvement, which may or may not be the case pending regulations, I don't think they're going to be willing to pay for that service or that R&D right away.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on top of that, because I think you hit the nail on the head on that one. I think another aspect of course, if there's any kind of course, government likes handing out money. So if there's any kind of incentive of saying, hey, we're going to fund this project to kind of push this forward. So I don't know how that's going to shape up or how it's going to form, but I think it will be some time before we kind of see some of that definitely start to trickle to some of the smaller operations. Definitely going to be, I think, an industry where some of the larger operations are going to definitely be a lot more prevalent with it.
Certainly an interesting question to try and answer as we move forward. We've talked a little bit about the regulations that may be going with Congress, with the FMCSA, of course, with that comment period going on right now. And now let's turn a little bit towards the law, because obviously things change when you take artificial intelligence and you put it in a vehicle that is going to be working within the public there as well. So joining us now is Matthew Leffler, the armchair attorney. And Matt, we're going to talk a little bit about how things change in terms of the overall aspect of how autonomy is going to change things as far as the law is concerned. Obviously, a truck is a truck is a truck. It's going to go down the road. It's going to try and deliver the freight. As you've said, freight is hard, and it's going to try and do it as well as possible. But there's going to be, unfortunately, that first time when an autonomous truck is going to be involved in an accident, and hopefully everyone will be okay. But at the same time, there's also the chance of a catastrophic event or a failure or a fatality there as well. So major concern looking forward now. Nobody's in the truck. How does this change things legally?
It's a great question. Thank you for having me, Bill. When we're talking about autonomous vehicles, the question is about what controls the action of the vehicle. And that is the software development. That is the programming that makes the decisions. If you're talking true automation, and if you're talking true automation, you're talking about what's looked at as product liability. The whole regime we have in industry today for transportation is a negligence regime, a duty of care, a breach of the duty, causation, and then liability with damages. But with product liability, it's manufacturer. It's the designer who's actually going to be the one who's at fault, or the one they're going to be exploring for liability. If the driver cannot intervene, the driver cannot be held legally liable. So the entire way we look at our industry changes when you change the method of what controls that asset.
So when you look at this from, say, a plaintiff-defendant standpoint, and someone's been involved in a catastrophic accident and decides to sue, we've just had, of course, the Miller C.H. Robinson case that went to the Supreme Court. We had the Landstar case just recently that decided things went another way. In terms of how far does this claim go now when you take this into an autonomous truck level? In other words, there's the argument, of course, that you can sue the broker in terms of the C.H. Robinson case. But in terms of this, if you're suing the software maker, are you suing the software maker? Are you suing the carrier? Are you suing even down to anybody that worked on the program at all?
Let me be clear. We're going to sue everybody. We're going to figure out exactly who touched it. But to your point, the software developers have to make decisions. If a truck is in a situation where it has to avoid a pedestrian or avoid another vehicle, what life does it prioritize? Is it the driver? Is it the motoring public? And that decision must be made in the development of the software. It's not something that the robot can just decide sua sponte on its own. It will decide that based on how it's programmed. And plaintiffs' attorneys are going to say, I'd like to understand the decision-making behind the motor, what made the machine do the thing that it did. So often in these types of cases, we look at the last clear chance to avoid the accident. And a lot of data is going to be available in these machines. And we talk about how fast this comes, if it's a couple of years, a couple of decades, but this is what drives one of the largest costs in transportation, labor. If you can save money, you will see adoption rapidly if it can get the goals we talk about for safety. And so they're going to be looking at everything from the development of the software to the manufacturer who outsourced that software. And all of these different things could become fair game for plaintiff attorneys who are looking to take care of somebody who's been catastrophically injured.
So let me take this a slightly different direction than we've taken in the past. Let's say you're a carrier and you've decided to employ.
I lost your audio.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let's say, for instance, you're a carrier and you've gotten autonomous technology, you've put it in your truck. How much trouble have you just given your legal team?
I think you've actually solved a lot of problems that might otherwise have. Look, we're trying to safely deliver freight on time and undamaged. And something that robots probably do pretty well is follow the rules that are in front of you. A lot of the things that we see, the liability we find is distracted driving, and technology has begun to encroach all around the driver, not just ELDs, not just forward-facing cameras, not anti-collision systems that are part of the truck and the trailer, not just driver-facing cameras. We are going to augment every aspect of moving these vehicles, and over time, the robots will likely prove safer. This question that we have is an existential question. What jobs do we want to automate? And I think risk managers, if they can prove the technology can safely deliver freight and on time and undamaged, that adoption is going to happen very rapidly. In this business, the most efficient way to run a vehicle is to slip seat it, have multiple drivers using that same vehicle on that same day. The vehicle does not get tired. The robot does not need a meal period. It does not need hours of service. These things that are impediments to successfully delivering freight start to evaporate with technology. And we have, as we talked before, of high school educated men, it is the most common job in all 50 states to be a motor vehicle operator. And we are going to see these jobs change over time. And what will remain is hard to say at this point.
So let me take this a slightly different route again. So if you're looking at, developing the software and making the software decide one way or the other how it's going to handle certain situations, ultimately, who do you want making that decision? Is that going to be someone that says the CEO of the company and that's who's going to do it? Or do you say, hey, federal government, what do you want us to do?
Yeah, I think you start off, in my opinion, you start off with the federal government. Government, tell me what's the right decision. I'll do the thing you tell me to do. If you have a CEO who makes the decision, maybe that is good for experiment to see what makes the most sense. But at the end of the day, we would prefer that in my opinion, we prefer the government to have access to how these things are developed and how they make those decisions so that we can all agree this is the right way to do it. But that decision has to be made. It is not something that can be left ambiguous. That decision tree of who gets preserved in a catastrophic event must be programmed to the machine. And We want to have accountability for the decisions that our developers make in order to, again, safely deliver freight on time and undamaged at a reasonable price.
That being said, if it's already known what the computer is going to do per se, does that necessarily just kind of make the case for the plaintiff? Okay, here's what happened. This is what you're going to be allocated based on what the computer did.
I think you do. I mean, the question of liability is who had the right to be able to avoid the accident. And if the computer behaves different than what it's programmed to behave, then you have that product liability piece. Even in a perfect scenario where everything is done correctly with the federal government's regulatory power, you can still have things that happen. Oftentimes, the people who are involved with motor vehicle accidents that are truck drivers, they're not responsible. They're just involved because some pedestrian on there or some motorist with their cell phone didn't see what was happening. So I think it's not going to necessarily make the plaintiff's case, but it will change the way we think about liability, because when that driver is removed, that pathway to that money, that liability judgment is going to be who made that software and who developed it and deployed it and how much testing it had and whether it behaved the way it was supposed to behave. So we will have far more types of discovery, but I think it'll be a really interesting path over time. And we have to get ready for this before it happens.
Got about 1 minute left here. Let me give you this. Obviously, when this happened, this is going to be a huge case, no matter who gets it. And obviously, the precedent is going to be set on the first case. How important is that going to be that the judges get it right the first time?
I don't think they have to get it right the first time. I mean, the way our federal system works is that each one of these circuits has its own kind of lay of the land and how they behave. And there might be conflicts in the circuits, as we've talked about with the Miller case and the Landstar case, but we want to test and we don't want people to be unnecessarily endangered. So that's why these FMCSA's supplemental proposed rules are so important to understand what is the safety that's going to be required. But it's probably the case that a lot of this gets messed up. I mean, you're going to have judges who have no idea how autonomous trucks function, no idea. Lawyers who have no idea how this stuff works. So it'll take a lot of education, not just to the judges and the lawyers, but also the juries that get involved. There is just so much uncertainty that will start to clarify over the next few months, years, and likely decades.
Yeah, especially when, of course, this first comes to fruition. Hopefully we don't see it, but it's inevitable there as well. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bill.
State of autonomy and where it's going. We're bringing in a specialist in that particular area, Don Burnett, the CEO and co-founder of Kodiak Robotics, as he joins us. And Don, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
It's my pleasure. Great to be here.
We in the Western world have been inundated, say, for the last 150 years with a great deal of science fiction. We've been told about things like warp drive. We've been told about things like the transporter, which can put you from a spaceship down to a planet. We've talked about other things like that. And autonomous trucks seem to start to be in line with that kind of vision. And so I just want to start off the conversation by asking, what is Kodiak's motivation in getting into an autonomous truck space?
Well, it's always good to be put in the same category as teleportation. So I feel like we've really reached it when we get to that level. At the end of the day, the reason that I and many other folks have got into this space was all about safety. So our roadways are incredibly dangerous places to be. 40,000 Americans die on our public roads each and every year. And that's really what spurred the initial research and work and thought around self-driving vehicles. Now, when you think about specific use cases, and in our case, long-haul trucking, there are many other benefits beyond just safety. There's efficiency, there's cost, there's reliability, there's resiliency in the supply chain. And so these are some of the areas that we think that our technology is going to bring to the supply chain, and it's a really exciting time.
Obviously, we've got a long way to go from where we are right now to getting to, say, for instance, level 5 trucks moving at great degrees across the entire country. What do you think is the biggest obstacle that autonomous trucking faces between from where we are now to that point? What's the biggest hurdle we have to get over?
Well, I think it's important for folks to understand that self-driving trucks are actually on the road today, delivering freight day in and day out. We have many partners that we've announced over the last 18 months that we work with on a 7-day, a seven day per week basis. So our trucks are out there running in autonomous mode, delivering freight all across the United States today. Now, we still have a safety driver behind the wheel. So there is a human sitting in the driver's seat, monitoring the system, ensuring that the truck is safe. But as we progress on the technology, we're really able to handle just about everything the highway environment throws at us today. And so that's no longer the bottleneck for autonomous trucks becoming fully driverless, which is ultimately the goal. We are still working on our safety case, and our safety case is that validation step that we need to ensure that we're as safe as a human driver before we're ready to take that safety driver out. So it comes down to ensuring you have the proper redundancies. That means redundant braking systems, redundant steering systems, redundant power systems. When you're being controlled by a computer, you can't have your power fail. So we need to make sure we have backups in place for all of those systems. When you are driving your car down the road and you press that brake pedal, you're actually directly connected to the underlying braking system. And so you can overpower it if you lose your power brakes. But for an autonomous system, we can't do that. So we need to make sure that we have redundant and reliable systems there. And that's just going to take a little bit longer for us to build. But I think in the next couple of years, you're going to see driverless trucks deployed out on public roads, moving freight all over the country.
Obviously, when new technologies and new breakthroughs come along, the federal government loves to stick its nose into things. And obviously, we've got a comment period right now with the FMCSA concerning autonomous vehicles. What are your concerns when it comes to federal regulation of any kind with regard to autonomous vehicles?
Well, we've had a fantastic relationship with FMCSA and all of the governmental bodies at the federal level, but also at the state level and even the municipal levels. We talk to all of the state DOTs. We're in communication with Highway Patrol. Really, we look at this as a holistic picture. It's not just one government entity that really matters at the end of the day. We need to make sure that everyone up and down the chain is comfortable with the deployment of this technology. Now, at the federal level, to answer your question specifically, we actually think that this is a step in the right direction. It would give us and other companies and other operators of the roadway a lot of comfort to know that there is federal regulation that is providing some kind of guidelines for how these trucks are being operated. We do think that that is the responsible path. That being said, obviously the devil is always in the details, and that's really where it matters. That's where we're digging in with the federal government to make sure that they understand what are the actual limitations of this technology. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that this is deployed safely and responsibly. That's our number one priority. And whether or not the federal government actually ends up passing rules and regulations or not, our plan is to make sure that our trucks are as safe as a human driver and can handle everything that's necessary out on the roadways.
That's a great point there as well. I hate to ask this question, but I feel like I have to, unfortunately. Obviously, at some point, you would have to think that we would have an accident involving an autonomous truck that involves a catastrophic injury or fatality. We had the C.H. Robinson case last year in the Supreme Court that said that a plaintiff can sue a broker now as well as the carrier and the shipper of that. What are your concerns? Maybe not if, but when that happens, not necessarily to Kodiak, but just to anybody that could possibly be in the space when that unfortunately might occur?
Well, this is something that we think about all the time, and obviously we take really seriously. We want to minimize the opportunity for this type of incident to occur. But as you said, inevitably, this type of incident is going to happen. And I think at that point, it comes down to what type of data are you collecting? What type of validation did you provide in your safety case that says, hey, we're actually safe enough to deploy these systems? At the end of the day, we want to be as safe or safer than human drivers. And the good thing is that our trucks and self-driving trucks in general will never get drowsy. They'll never drive drunk. They'll never drive tired. They're always paying attention 360 degrees around the vehicle. So we'll have the data. We'll be able to understand the problem. We'll have the cameras and the LiDAR and the radar. We'll be able to reconstruct the situation. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with us, and we take responsibility for the performance of our autonomy system. And we have to own up to that. That's why the onus is really on companies that are developing this technology to ensure that you have all the proper safeguards in place. And we want to make sure that our system is not responsible for behaviors or maneuvers that would ultimately increase the likelihood of these types of incidents to occur. That being said, there's lots of things that can happen out on the roadways. You and I drive probably every day, and we see all kinds of crazy things. And so you can't prevent all incidents. That's not our goal in the short term. In the long term, we would like to eliminate all accidents on the roadways. I think that's actually possible, but we have to take a responsible look at what are the safeguards we can put in place and make sure that those safeguards are enforced.
Yeah, obviously, when you could say anytime anything fails, you obviously either you win. If you win, if you lose, you learn. You definitely can learn from your mistakes there as well. All right, let's jump back out to the positive aspects of this. Level 5, obviously, big goal. You're very close to that there as well. Where do you see this technology going from here? I mean, I'm not asking for business plans necessarily, but if you look at, is there a level 6 for Kodiak, a level 7? Where do you see this technology going?
Well, Kodiak is really a self-driving company at heart. We think that long-haul trucking is the best application to be focusing on initially, with constrained roadways, repeatable routes that you can drive back and forth, and it provides a lot of good and a lot of value. We can save lives, we can increase efficiency, and we can reduce costs. That's good for everyone across the board. But we're not... Rather, I would say, ultimately, I believe that the entire transportation industry will be automated in the future. It's going to take a long time to get there, but we think that our technology is applicable to other applications beyond just long-haul trucking. I'll give you a very quick example. We recently signed a contract with the U.S. Army to provide autonomous technology to one of their mobile platform vehicles. And so now we're working on driving off-road environments and more unstructured environments, places where we can't initially go in and pre-map, if you can imagine. So the technology is broadly applicable to other applications, and I think we're going to push farther and farther into that transportation network as the wins come in and as the technology matures.
Well, if there's autonomous flying trucks, I'm sure that you're going to be around that industry there as well. Don Burnett, co-founder and CEO of Kodiak Robotics, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Good talking with him there as well. And so let's come down and let's talk about how this is going to affect the American truck driver, because eventually, of course, at the end of the day, it is removing someone from a driver's seat in that way, shape, or form. Let's take a look and bring in Marilyn Serber, who's on the advisory team there at 10th Street, and also Jeremy Raymer, the CEO of Driver Reach. And it's great to see you both. And this is an interesting conversation to have when it talks about autonomous technology. Everybody can talk about its great benefits, but at the end of the day, it affects people in more ways than we'd like to think. So Marilyn, let me start with you. How does autonomy affect recruitment and retention for the American truck driver?
Well, I think that there's a lot more unknown there than is known today, right? I think let's start with retention, because maybe that's the easiest question to answer there. Is I would think whether it's driver assisted or whether it's driver operated from somewhere else, I think it stands to have a positive impact on retention, right? It should absolutely improve the quality of life for the driver, again, and the quality of the job, again, whether that is in the driver assisted technology where they're actually behind the wheel, but they can, be focusing on managing the technology and driving in a different way that hopefully allows them to feel a little bit less of that stress. Or when we get there, and it's driver operated from possibly a control room somewhere, again, that really opens up the ability to recruit in a whole different way, but also should both things should lend themselves to a better recruiting or retention environment, excuse me. And I think from a recruiting perspective, and I'll be interested to hear Jeremy's take, but I know, Dawn, we were talking about we don't really know what the regulations are going to be yet. And I don't think we can understand how it's going to impact recruiting until we see how it's going to be regulated and until we have the requirements there that those folks are going to have when it does change.
Gotcha. Jeremy, fire away. What do you think?
Well, I know, Don Burnett even said himself that it's a long time, right, before we get there in terms of completely, autonomous. And so kind of to Marilyn's point on the semi-autonomous functionality, that I believe from a recruiting standpoint enhances, I think it makes it easier to attract more drivers who believe that it's a better experience for them. I have a car that has semi-autonomous functionality, and it is a better experience to drive, especially when I'm on, highways, and you can put that on and you still are engaged. You're not like taking a nap, but at the same time, I think it's safer and it allows just for a better experience. So I think from an attraction of, drivers and recruiting standpoint, I think it's a A+.
Jeremy, let me throw this next one at you first, because I know we've talked about it a lot between ourselves, and I've heard you talk about a lot, of course, is the driver shortage. Does autonomy put a bit of a wedge in that problem? If there's an 80,000 driver shortage in this country, is autonomy perhaps an answer to try and make up some of those, if not all of those jobs? Not necessarily, obviously, immediately, because the technology is still not there, but over time, is this a possible solution?
Well, I mean, in theory it is, right? But again, when? And
yeah, true.
Worse than that, we're talking about this. I think it hurts the shortage today, and it makes it worse because people who are considering what their career is going to be, when they're, especially today, 21 and over, what am I going to be doing? It may not be because of all the talking points of hearing from, autonomous trucks and you're not going to need drivers anymore. Then it sort of steers them into a different direction, for no pun intended. But the concern that I would have there is that's not a valid talking point. Stop thinking that that's tomorrow. I think today, somebody who's 21 years old, who gets their CDL, can have a 20, 30 plus year career in trucking without the risk of being completely unseated from the cab. I think there will always be a need for a driver to be at the helm, even with fully autonomous level 5 technology.
Yeah, I think that's a veritable truth that most people think that we're not going to see a true takeover, if you will, of autonomy, but we're going to see some work here and work there, and obviously it may work in some areas of the country geographically and not in others. Marilyn, what do you see how this affects possible driver shortage in terms of the needs that may present, let's say, in 30 years or so?
Yeah, and I agree with Jeremy. I think people outside of the industry, I get that question more from friends or people that I run into that aren't in trucking about, there's driverless trucks out there hauling everything. And it's like, no, we're a long way off. We are going to need drivers for a long time. But I also think, the driver shortage, there's a shortage of a lot of jobs, right? Jobs where people aren't away from their home, weeks at a time, and jobs where, it's not hard and it's not all those things. And it's still hard to put people in all of those jobs. And so I think we have a labor shortage really in general. And so I don't think that driver assisted technology or even, driver operated technology is going to be a silver bullet. I think we need to focus on some of the other initiatives that we have going, with the 18 to 20 year olds and, attracting next gen and training next gen and all of those things is going to be huge. And I think that the technology that is coming about for driver assisted and driver operated trucks is really even more attractive to that generation. So I think that we need to be beating that drum and talking about the technology advances that we're doing and the money that you can make and the flexibility that comes along with some of the things that you can do in trucking. And that is not going to go away for the next 20 to 30 years. And so I think that we just need to be shouting that from the rooftops, that we need drivers and we're going to need drivers, but it's a pretty cool job and it's not your granddad's trucking job, right? And so I think that those are what we need to focus on to help us recruit the next generation of talent, no matter what the operation of that truck looks like.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's definitely going to come in at some point, but I also have to believe that it's not going to come in all at once. In other words, it's not just going to come in and do that as well. So, Jeremy, through that to that end, let me ask you this question: how do you think trucking is going to evolve over the course of the next 30 years, given that this possibility is always somewhat on the horizon?
I think you'll see a younger audience, start being attracted to the industry, because they embrace technology. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about technology, and adding technology. It improves the driver experience. It improves safety on the highways. It's a win-win, and you're going to be able to attract a younger driver. So I think honestly, I don't look at, and hear about, fully autonomous technology as a death knell. I embrace it. It's going to evolve, to your point. And to Marilyn's point, this is not your grandfather's trucking industry.
Marilyn, how do you see things evolving over the course of the next 3 decades?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the average age of the driver is already trending down, right? It's like 7 years, 8 years younger just in the last 10 years than it was, right? Partly because of COVID and partly just because baby boomers are aging out of the job. And so I think that technology is going to become even more of a center and more of what our job is built around. I think you hear folks like Jim Ward and Mark Holson talk about changing the name of truck driving, to a driver operator or something like that. And I think that is definitely going to make a lot more sense, right, as the technology continues to evolve. And they really do, drivers really do become more like operators of the vehicle. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity in our industry to win here and to be, out front leading with this technology and talking about all the cool things that you can do in trucking because of the technology, and making it a more flexible job and a more appealing job to that next generation. And so I think that's the evolution that you're going to see, is just more technology first and more flexibility in the job, which is really what we need, right? And it's really what we talk about when we talk about retention and why, and recruiting, why people don't come into trucking and why they leave. It has a lot to do with that flexibility component. And I think that we'll be able to leverage technology to make the truck driving job a lot more flexible and appealing.
We've got about a couple of minutes left here, Jeremy. Let me throw this one at you as we kind of wrap things up here. Obviously, we've talked about autonomy in terms of what it can give us. Obviously, it can be a great gift there as well. Positives aside here for just a second, is there anything that worries you at all about what this new technology could be for us in 30 years?
Well, maybe not in 30 years, but the path to get there, I think there'll be a lot of awful things that happen, right? Accidents, mistakes. That's just the nature of the evolution of technology like this. I mean, I love American history, and when you talk about like the light bulb and the history of like incandescent and like street lamps, what we used to have well before that, you'd have birds getting killed left and right, just dead carcasses at the bottom of these lamps, just because of the evolution before we got to a point where that wasn't a thing anymore. And the only reason why I'm using it as a parallel to where we are today. Like I can see that those sorts of things happening in time.
Marilyn, any concerns at all? Yeah,
I think that that I agree. It's kind of, we're going to have some bad things happen so that we can learn from them. We're going to have that bad accident so we can see what plaintiffs' attorneys are going to go after in accidents with autonomous vehicles or driver-assisted vehicles. And so I think that there's a long road from a legislative perspective. And I agree. I think that it definitely is going to make us safer. I just think that we don't know what we don't know yet. And we're going to have to find out as we go, because this is all brand new.
So it sounds though, Jeremy, you're saying let's turn into the skid and embrace technology moving forward. Yes? I think we may have lost him there. Nope. Marilyn, are we turning into the skid?
Yes, we are. Yes, embrace the technology.
Absolutely, even though technology may have failed us here just a little bit. Marilyn Serber and Jeremy Raymer, thanks so much for joining us. All right. It is hard to believe that just under 100 years ago, the radio flyer was introduced to the American public as a radio-controlled device designed to transport one person. That radio flyer is the same one as the famous red wagon that you might be familiar with. Yet we are 3 years shy of the 100th anniversary of Francis Houdina's American Wonder and on track to see level 5 autonomy perhaps over the course of the next 30 years. Will it be the perfect wave that will help freight transfer across the country, or will it be the tsunami the industry doesn't want to see with regard to jobs? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but for the moment, all we can do is watch and hang on for the ride. I'd like to thank my guests so much for bringing their wisdom and perspective to this, including Lauren Smith, also Rainey Willett, Alan Adler, Marilyn Serber, Jeremy Raymer, also Matt Leffler there, as well as everyone else that joined us on the program. We'll join you next month for another edition here of FreightWaves Presents, where we take a look at California and the lead that is giving the rest of the country in terms of emissions. We'll see you next month.